Okay, thank you everybody for being able to skip a week. Just turned out that I needed to not be here last Wednesday, and so we are not finishing the book today, which we were sort of scheduled to do, and it would have worked out kind of just right, but oh well, things happen. So we're going to be doing chapter 11. This is the next to last chapter. This is what we would have done last week, and we'll just do it this week, which means we will conclude with our final chapter, not next week, because if you're here live, that would be the day before Thanksgiving, and we're not going to do that. So we will we'll skip over, and we will meet the week after to finish off the book. All right, great. Okay, so chapter 11. I think this might have been the longest single chapter that we've done. And it just kept going. And every time I thought it was done, it would have a new subsection. This is one of those times that I will take a bit of exception with his narrative. Again, it's super easy way after the fact, and with no regard for this being a classic that millions of people have read over hundreds of years now, but lengthy parts of this chapter sort of annoyed me with I want to make a point, therefore I will just have two people have a conversation where they give bullet points to each other. That seemed to happen like 3 times. So he very much wanted to explain something, but rather than just say it, we break it into conversation. So we're going to have several conversations. All the conversations will be very instructive. These are basically these are pedagogical teaching conversations. As a matter of fact, it reminded me quite a bit of reading a catechism. Where you ask a question and you get this lengthy, detailed answer. Tell me, Christian, why should I believe in Jesus? Well, I'm glad you asked, and blah, 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 blah. And he gives like 15 bullet points and an outline. But that's all right. He's getting across his information, and we're still in our narrative. As a matter of fact, getting back to our narrative, where are we? Like, what's our geographical location at this point?
I never thought of it.
Okay, we are still on the narrow path.
Yeah.
Okay, we are approaching the land of enchantment. Remember, we had been in the Delectable Mountains. Yeah. The shepherds kind of gave them a bird's eye view from a hilltop about where they're headed. They even saw the celestial city, didn't they? Yeah. Like in the distance, they can see the gates. And then they were warned about, there's more trials and tribulations on the way. You will go into this next area, and it will be this land of enchantment. And whatever you do, don't fall asleep. And as this is being described, I had only one vision in my mind, and that is the Wizard of Oz and the Wicked Witch looking in her crystal ball. Poppies will put them to sleep, where they walk through the field of poppies, and they all that's what I caught out of this. So anyway, Christian and Hopeful are now back on the way after the Delectable Mountains, and they're headed towards the celestial city, which they have now caught a glimpse of in the distance. And here we go. So what happens to start off this chapter is they're walking down the trail.
They meet ignorance.
They meet somebody. Before they meet ignorance, though, right?
Oh, yeah.
They meet somebody new.
A dark man in a white robe.
A dark man in a white robe who says, "Oh, I also am on the way to the celestial city." Now, why did Christian and Hopeful appreciate seeing this man when they did? Do you recall the circumstances? Okay, they're pondering which way to go because there are now two narrow ways, and they're kind of running parallel. So this has happened before. Because I remember the illustration about how around Jupiter that the Turnpike and I-95 run parallel. You can kind of look through the trees and see the other roadway. So the last time this happened, the narrow path that they were on was very rocky. It was hurting their feet. And there was another soft, springy, spongy path running next to it, which they took just because they were getting kind of miserable. Well, if you recall, this one is described as being basically identical. It is also a narrow path, and it's kind of running parallel here, and they are getting a little confused about which one they should be on. So they see somebody on this other path, and this person is described as dark and wearing a white robe. Generally speaking, we are taking white robes to be positive signs.
Yeah.
And he speaks with authority.
With authority. So what does this guy say?
He's also going to the
I am also going, and I know the way. If you will follow me, I will be happy to lead you through. And so they wind up following him on this second pathway, and what happens?
All in the net.
All right, he disappears, and they are trapped, and they are stuck in a net. They now figure out who this guy is. His name is Flatterer. They were warned by the shepherds to beware of Flatterer, but they oopsie doodles. They forgot. And so now they are stuck. And they try to strain and stretch and pull, but they are stuck. Now, this actually doesn't last very long. Because almost immediately they are met by an angel. And what is unique about this angel?
He's carrying a whip.
He's carrying a whip. And so the angel, you know, what you doing? And they explain. And what's the angel's?
Did the shepherds not tell you?
Right. And what do they gotta say? Yeah. What didn't the shepherds give you a map?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
We
So-
forgot.
They forgot. Now, that is, I think, the little point to take from this. Not only were they warned about Flatterer, but in the very understandable concern about which of these two nearly identical looking paths is correct. And that almost seems a little unfair, but remember, they were just given a map. They don't bother to look at it. It never comes up until after the fact. And this wasn't something that was brought up chapters and chapters ago. It was the shepherds, right, who gave them a map just, you know, minutes before. So they woulda, coulda, shoulda. This is one where they definitely could have avoided this. And so the angel cuts them out and then does what?
Leads them down to the,
Okay, I'm gonna lead you back,
and then he's gonna chastise.
but then I'm gonna chastise you.
yeah.
So chastisement in this sense, meaning what?
Wait.
He whips them. He smacks them around and hurts them, I guess. And so we would probably tend to think of chastisement as a verbal rebuke. no. That's well, there's a little no in there, but he gives him a little physical pain. This is connected to various scripture readings. What is the point of whipping them?
Stop being so disobedient.
Right? Stop being so disobedient, but it's also it's connected to something about the character of God and his relationship with us.
Yeah. Who the Lord who loves me is.
Whoever the Lord loves, he chastises. And so let's, this does sound a little rough, but let's take it in the line of overly permissive parents who never correct or discipline their children are doing their children no favors. Oh, I just want them to be free and live. Like, the kids need the structure, and they actually suffer when you don't give them the structure and the discipline. And the punishment or the chastisement or the spankings or whatever it might be, but some sort of corrective action that doesn't just let a child do whatever they want, but they have to be trained and taught. And so if you care enough, you correct. God doesn't just leave us to our own device and say, well, good enough, and then allow us to wander into traffic. I'm trying to remember if it was Karl Barth or not, but it was some famous theologian who said, the wrath of God is his passionate no. So, we might read passage about the wrath of God and think, oh, God's just mean or whatever. Well, the way that it was described by this theologian was equivalent to your toddler slipping their hands out and running towards traffic. What do you, oh, little dear, no!
Yeah.
Right? Or you snatch them. Is it because you hate them? No. Out of love, you do something that is even potentially painful because the stakes are so high. This is not a matter that's up for debate. I don't want you to get hit by a car. I realize you want to get hit by a car. So let's compromise and let you get hit by a smaller car instead. Like, what? No. So the passionate no is this chastisement, which we see through the whips of the angel. All right. Now we are back finally on the path, and they're going to meet somebody else. Who do they meet? Atheist. This is also a very short interaction. We basically get like 3 quick ones: bang, 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 flatterer, the angel of chastisement, and atheist, and they're all like a page.
Yeah.
So what do we get from the how does that interaction go with atheist?
He laughs at their belief.
He just laughs. That's kind of the big point here. Where are you going? We're going to the celestial city. Ha 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 ha. Scornful laughter. Now, what explanation does atheist give for the scornful laughter?
He's been far and about and for 20 years, and you never saw any such thing.
Right. So it doesn't exist, and you're stupid for thinking it does. And that's pretty much the depth, I think, of what we have from this particular interaction. It's not a very technical, or it's not a very complicated sort of argument, but it is very simply, I'm looking, I haven't found, therefore it doesn't exist, and anyone who thinks otherwise is not only much dumber than I am, but dumb enough to warrant scorn. There's a little bit of an interaction here with, this is one of the first sort of catechetical conversations, I think. So Christian basically asks Hope, like, oh, you think an atheist might be onto something here? And it gives Hope the opportunity, well, of course not, and blah, 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 and this is why we trust, and this is why it's true. And he seems shocked, like, oh, Christian, how could you be Possibly. Well, and Christian says, I was just giving you the chance to, to go ahead and answer this. I wanted to kind of see how you felt about it. I'm fine. And we'll see more of this in these longer sections where they're basically teaching one another. Anything else about atheists? I thought that one was pretty quick. I sort of expect a little bit more, but ultimately the point was atheist was basically self-deluded in his own competency, his own judgment to make these definitive and soul defining decisions. I have never been to Australia. Australia therefore does not exist. We would never approach that as a logical rational argument, and yet that is the argument of atheists here. Well, I've looked up it for a long time, and if I can't find it, it must not be so. And while that is rather short shrift to, the argument of atheism, I don't know that it's wrong. That at its fundamental level, the argument of the atheist is basically, I'm not convinced, therefore it cannot be. Which is the difference between, this is just a little, I'm going to throw this up, a technical definition. An atheist and an agnostic are oftentimes used interchangeably, but there's a technical difference. The agnostic says, I don't know if God exists. The atheist says, God does not exist. It's a negative logical statement to say there is no God, period. And that is the statement of the atheist. And ultimately, it's not dissimilar to what we see here. Well, I haven't seen it, therefore it cannot be true. There is a level of hubris to say on such a significant matter, you personally are able to define this for all times, places, and people. Your ability to understand something makes it true or false. Your ability to find something makes it exist or not. So, and I think that's where we are. Philosophically, I think the agnostic has a much better logical argument to sort of suggest I lack sufficient knowledge. There's always the hope, sort of like when we re-meet ignorance in a little bit, that ignorance can turn into knowledge, that a lack of knowledge can be improved with knowledge. But the atheism takes that steps further again to say absolutely, positively not.
And then they go, la, la, la.
Right. Okay. So we are now crossing the enchanted ground, and poppies will put them to sleep. So they start getting sleepy, and they were warned, and so they kind of know this, and they're sort of talking to each other like, are you getting sleepy? Yeah, I'm getting sleepy. What do we do? So what's their solution to falling asleep? Because both of them suggest at different times, you know what, there's like a quick nap won't hurt. But the other one is there to say no. What's their solution?
And start discussing their thoughts about God.
That's right. Let's have a conversation, and that'll keep us awake. I would have preferred a cup of coffee, but they want to talk. And so they begin to talk, and this is rather lengthy, and it feels, again, very catechetical. He wants to convey a bunch of information, and so he puts it in people's conversation. I didn't find it super interesting when he goes on these long like teaching conversations. But what I did like is it's really, this first long conversation is from Hopeful's point of view. And we actually get a little bit of a story attached with it. A lot of it is just conversation that's explaining the point. But what's Hopeful talking about in the narrative? Like, what's the story that Hopeful is using in order to give these teaching points?
It's his road to God.
Yes. So Hopeful is actually sharing like his conversion story. This is basically Hopeful's testimony, and that part of it I did like. I did sort of like filling in some of the gaps and giving a little backstory there. And this was an opportunity to get a different, we kind of caught Christian already converted at the beginning of the story, even if it was on shaky ground. And so we get a little more from Hopeful to say there was a moment he was and a moment he wasn't, and it actually intersects with our story. So how does Hopeful's testimony intersect with Christian's pilgrimage? Those two stories overlap. Where, or why, or how? Well, it starts off at a location. They're in the same place at the same time. What's that location? Vanity Fair. Vanity Fair. So Hopeful, whether he was, I guess he lived in Vanity Fair or something, but he had a shop in Vanity Fair. And what did he sell?
Nice thing.
Nice things, the kind of dumb stuff like, I'm selling worldly ambition and silver. Like, it was just like a list of, worldly riches and temptations and desirable things. It was pretty general, but basically, if we can remember back to Vanity Fair, it was kind of a cross between a giant flea market and a carnival that was all intended to show the enticing things of this world, and especially for the sake of distracting any pilgrims and keeping them from going any further. That the lures of this world would entrap them. And that's what Hopeful did. He sold worldly goods. And by that, we're intending to mean like fleshly desires and the ungodly things and the achievements that don't last. So something or someone really made a difference to Hopeful. What happened? And this is where it's and like I said, I'm not super crazy about the catechetical conversations, but this part of the backstory is not only kind of nice little testimonial, but it's also converging with the story, because the reason Hopeful is a pilgrim on the path to Celestial City.
He heard,
It's
he
faithful.
heard Faithful, and he heard Christian and Faithful talking about their faith.
That's right. So when Faithful and Christian were captured in Vanity Fair and put on trial, that made an impression on Hopeful. And Faithful is martyred at Vanity Fair. And that made an impression on Hopeful. And through this sort of long biographical conversation, we get, and we can talk about the ins and the outs in a sec, but basically this is the blood of the martyrs being the seeds of the next generation's faith. So Hopeful is on the path with Christian because of the witness and the martyrdom of Faithful. So what happened in Vanity Fair is strange and as kind of bad as it was, has resulted already in another life being changed. Hopeful, in essence, is one of the is the lost sheep that has been brought back. Then heaven rejoices. And what was the action that did it, other than the faithfulness of faithful, even unto death? So hopeful does sort of explain, like, there's a process for him. He didn't just like suddenly become a pilgrim on the path. He kind of talks about it in stages.
Yeah.
Do you recall sort of the broad strokes of how that went?
Well, he talks about how he kind of heard about it, that he enjoyed his drinking and carousing and
Right.
ignored it for a while, but and he kept hearing about it and he backed off a little bit. Didn't go all the way, but kept on inching forward.
Right. And there's even a nice little admission that there were times where he very purposely closed himself off because he was sort of worried that if he really opened himself up to the gospel, he was going to lose all these things he already enjoyed. So it was better to kind of put it out of my mind rather than continue to move forward. Because the further along I got, the more I realized it was going to take all of me, and I kind of wasn't ready. Now, whether or not, I mean, I came across this, I assume that it's true. But there was a notation in a different book that this description of Hopeful's testimony was actually Bunyan writing about himself. That this most closely mirrors his own testimony, like his own life, where he was the drunken carouser, and slowly but surely he starts cleaning up his life, and he has the opportunity to hear the gospel. He sort of worries about judgment, about the state of his own soul, but his solution early on is to just try to be a little better, and then try to be a little better than that, and then try to be a little better than that.
Did he have someone
Who was martyred?
asking questions, and keeping him?
Now that I don't know. Maybe that could be why he sort of patterns this the way that he did. But I did think that was sort of interesting because there's some detail given to this testimony that, is not only a little more specific than the others, because remember, Christians is a little broader. We kind of catch them in mid-process. Yeah, maybe this is coming from the voice of experience. Like maybe the reason why this particular testimony is as detailed as it is because Bunyan knew it firsthand.
Been there, done that.
Yeah, right. So he kind of comes to the realization that no matter how much he tries to improve, because he keeps trying to do better all the time, do a little better, do a little better, do a little better, but ultimately he feels no closer than he was before. I am reminded of a mathematical theorem. I'm trying to remember if it was like Zeno's paradox or something. Imagine a distance between point A and point B. Like I'm going, like from me to the door of the sanctuary. And I'm going to walk halfway there and stop. And I'm going to continue to do that. So I'm going to walk from halfway between here and the sanctuary, and I'm going to stop. All right. So I would be like down the sidewalk. And then I'm going to walk from where I am halfway to the sanctuary, and I'm going to stop. And so it is if you were to graph it out, it would make what they refer to as an asymptote, that curve that never, it approaches, but it never reaches its destination. So if you're always going halfway in between, you will never actually reach the destination.
Right.
It's just that the increments will get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. That's like saying, I'm going to share this cookie. So I'm going to break it in half. We're going to give half away, and then we're going to break that one in half, and then we're going to break that in half, and then you can always break something in half. It's just the halves get smaller and smaller and smaller, but it never goes to zero. So Hopeful tries as best he can to lead a better, good, even virtuous life. And he talks about church attendance and, is cleaning up his language and sort of stuff. But it takes a kind of a fundamental change to rely not on his ability to improve himself sufficiently, but what? To rely on God. So, Bunyan being an evangelical is going to make a very sharp distinction about the graciousness of God and our utter reliance on that gracious gift that our works not only cannot achieve, but are really antithetical toward. He's going to take a hardline position, especially when he starts getting into ignorance in a little bit. But this is where I think we're actually getting an insight into Bunyan himself. And maybe part of the reason why he can come across as sharply as he can, because he is someone who feels like I have personally tried as hard as I could to do things better, and I've seen how I never made it. And it took giving up on myself and on my ability in order to fully and utterly rely on God's grace. Anything else about that testimony? Anything else about Hopeful's story? It gets very poetic. It gets very emotional. If I had 1,000 gallons of blood in my body, I would willingly spill it all for the sake of our Lord Jesus. But that's this depth of gratitude. And I think part of the reason why the pendulum swings so hard back towards this depth of emotion and devotion is to kind of prepare us for talking. We're going to have this interaction with ignorant again. And setting up this very stark contrast between a trust in yourself and your abilities or in anything else, and the utter reliance on Christ, and the connection then to our virtuous behavior, which is always following grace and not preceding it. Because they're going to get into this with ignorance about, where is grace located within your virtuous behavior, and ignorance will give a little more of a sacramental understanding about working with us, and Christian hopefully are going to reject that utterly, to say basically everything that we do must come after our reliance on grace as a response in gratitude, not as a working through the way. And I think, again, I'm suggesting maybe that's why it's as stark as it is. Anything else? All right, we are not done. We're getting into, we got 2 more big sections. We're going to meet somebody else. Who is it? Hey, who's that way back there coming up from behind us?
Very something. Ignorance.
There's ignorance again. So, what happened last time with ignorance? Because they've met him before. It was a few chapters ago.
Yeah, they tried to talk to him, he just wouldn't listen.
Yeah, he maintained his position and they.
Right.
just walked
And so basically they kind of argue in essence, and he decides, I don't really want to walk with you guys anymore. And Christian and Hopeful basically said, we'll keep on going. We're going to leave him behind. And it's actually Hopeful who is hopeful and says, well, maybe we'll meet him again. Christian's like, he's over it. But Hopeful says, like, don't like crush this guy utterly, because maybe we will have a chance to talk to him again. And here he comes. So we might have mentioned this briefly when we first met him. What does ignorance actually mean? Unknowing.
Lack of knowledge.
It's a lack of knowledge. So this is, you know, we kind of contrasted atheism and agnosticism. And so ignorance is a position or a lack of position held through a lack of knowledge. I don't know the truth, or I know incorrectly. And someone, we often sort of attribute or we conflate ignorance and foolishness or stupidity, and we really shouldn't, at least in a technical sense. You may be very smart, but be ignorant. How?
Just not knowing about something.
Okay. Who of us is an expert in every subject? Nobody. Nobody. We all have different competencies in different things, but there's going to be something, and it might even be something that's really important, that we are just way in over our heads about. Like, I don't know anything about that. So that makes us ignorant, at least on that particular subject. Now, it's often used in a more sweeping sense. When we say that someone is an ignorant person, we tend to not mean about a narrow field. What do we tend to mean?
Stupid.
We tend to mean stupid, but we can also say in a sense of maybe, even if you're using it a little more charitably, I would say uneducated.
About the ways of how to treat people,
Okay.
about social things rather than about factual things.
Quite possibly, yes. Yes. So there is hope that the ignorant may cease being ignorant if they learn the truth. That could be a matter of presenting it to someone for the first time, or it could be a matter of the person receiving it. Can you be ignorant of something even after it's explained to you?
Yeah.
Okay, how?
You don't understand.
Yes.
Okay, you still don't understand.
Don't have any experience.
You don't have any experience, so you don't, remember that we're always weighing and judging how much we believe or trust something. To go back to the ridiculous example, I've never been to Australia. I still believe it exists. Why? And for all sorts of reasons. I've seen pictures, I've seen video. My grandparents actually visited Australia, and I trusted the fact that when they told me that that's where they went, that they weren't lying to me. Other books and authorities have said, no, this continent actually exists. So I've had enough information that I deem authoritative and reliable that my own senses are sort of overruled. And I'm content to do that. But there could be other things where we're not. Where we're judging, do I trust this person's word or not? Did you take that cookie? I did not take that cookie.
But it's okay, Mom.
Well, I see crumbs on your mouth, which leads me to believe that your testimony is not reliable. Now, we can be wrong. We cannot trust somebody who is actually telling us the truth. We can have competing stories and they're all plausible and we just pick incorrectly. I will say that there is something that can be referred to as a willful ignorance, which if we were to sort of think through it, almost changes the nature of ignorance, right? Because it's not so much about not knowing something, it's more like choosing not to know. And I'm not sure those are really the same thing.
Yeah.
Well, that would be like holding up a prejudice against something and not accepting anything that the other person had to say.
Sure. You know, it can be presented to you in a reliable fashion, but you just say no.
Yeah.
If at this point you are insisting that the earth is flat, and some people do, I mean, that's a choice at this point. That's not really ignorance in the sense of, I never knew. Like you've said, I've looked at all sorts of information and I choose X and not Y. I don't care what you say. We could still call that ignorant, but I think that's maybe different than ignorance. We could call it willful ignorance, but I'm still, it seems to have kind of grown into something else. Remember when we talked a few chapters ago about the nature of despair? Despair theologically is believing that God cannot or will not help you. And there is a willfulness to that. It could start off in a position of ignorance. Why would God help somebody like me? But it becomes different when you insist upon it and it sort of solidifies. You know, when you mix water into dry concrete, it's powdery cement and it's rocky aggregate. You put water in it, you stir it up, and a chemical reaction happens. And you can't pull the water back out at that point. It just gets harder and harder and harder, and it's no longer powdery, and it's no longer the little bits of rock. It's now become something solid. I didn't realize this until I saw a documentary some time ago, but concrete continues to harden for decades. We can't tell the difference because when concrete is hard for a couple of days, it just seems hard to us. Like, yep, that's hard, but that same slab of concrete in 50 years, it'll be super incremental, but it's technically and actually harder than it was, and it will continue to do so. We just can't, I mean, you can't really feel the difference, but there is, at least on an extremely subtle level, the difference. So we're going to talk about, you know, this interaction with ignorance here, but this is, when is it not knowing and when is it I have already decided and I am simply not up for any new knowledge. So
Yeah, at first, ignorance almost seems like the latter.
right?
Truly resists their ideas.
Yes. All right, so we see ignorance from a distance. Hopeful says, hey, maybe we should slow up. And maybe this is basically providential. God has allowed him to catch up with us, perhaps for a purpose. And so I don't think Christian's super into it. But hopeful is hopeful. And so they wind up walking together. And ignorance is like, sure, I'll walk with you again. And they have a conversation. How's it go?
Ignorance say, I'd rather walk alone.
That's how it ends up. It ends up with ignorance saying, yeah, I think I liked it better when I was friends. And to be perfectly frank, I almost don't blame him because, boy, I mean, just Christian gives them both barrels full. No, you're wrong. This is why. No, you're in judgment. This is why. no, you will be cast out. This is why. And it's like, whoo, it's a little sharp. So I don't necessarily recommend this evangelistic technique. But we get within this interaction a very thorough, sort of a works righteousness
Yeah.
debate. It's a little more subtle than that. This is maybe one of the more subtle theological interactions. I don't happen to agree with how strident Bunyan gets in this. I think he kind of goes a little cross the line. But again, I think this is a product of the times. It's a product of a particular theological perspective. This is, 16th century Reformation. We have some very clear lines between Reformed theology and Catholic theology, and those lines need to be crystal clear. And this is a matter of life and death in a variety of ways. It is a matter of temporal life and death because people are dying over these debates, but it is also a matter of eternal consequence, because if I'm right about this or if I'm wrong about this, then what does that mean for eternity? So these are big questions that they're asking, and they want to be as correct as possible.
Now, what about believing that the earth is flat?
Right.
Let's just say, because at one point, that was the belief that everybody believed it,
Okay.
and it was flat. And when you got to the edge, I guess you fell off. No one ever got that far.
No. Complete tangent, but just FYI, it was not the church that tried to convince people that the earth was flat. It wasn't the church that said astronomers who say different are heretics. This is a conflation and not just an oversimplification, but it's just wrong. As a matter of fact, it's, a lot of the Renaissance astronomy and mathematical rediscovery was done by monks and by clergy. The ancient Greeks, the ancient Egyptians were able to roughly but fairly accurately calculate the circumference of the spherical earth. This is not anything like, Galileo discovered this and was, they killed him because the church said, oh, they're flat. Like nobody ever knew. Like, no, there's always been, now the degree to which your average peasant knows anything about it is certainly up for debate, and makes perfect sense that if you don't know anything, it sure looks flat to me. But as far as the learned are concerned, this was something that there's a variety of geometrical and proofs of physics that they've been able to do with like strings and stone and arithmetic.
They worked at it.
Yeah, for thousands of years. So let's kind of think through the ignorance's point of view for a second. They do get into a discussion, and this is not really even a starting question. It's almost an ending question, but I'm not sure where else to start, which is, what is ignorance ignorant about? Because he's not stupid.
No.
He's ignorant about Jesus Christ paying the price for us.
Okay, right. There is an element of a doctrinal definition of grace that ignorance either doesn't understand or doesn't want to have anything to do with. And this is the bone of contention, that ignorance.
I'm doing all right.
I'm doing all right.
My heart is good.
My heart. Well, how do you know your heart is good? Because my heart tells me so. And it does get a little circular, but it's not like feel like I would rather hang out with ignorance than I would with Christians sometimes. Like, I'd get a cup of coffee with ignorance and we could talk about Gator football. And I think Christian would say, why would you discuss such an ungodly pursuit?
Yeah.
Let us approach the scriptures together, my brother. And I was just like, okay,
Yes.
again, like, I don't know. This is I'm being kind of a goof with this, but
That's so-
ignorance has an attitude in this that is pretty easygoing, is not insisting on its own way, and is not unreasonable in its assertions. His responses are always very clear, very sharp, and very pointed. Now, I think it could be fairly described that Christian comes down like a ton of bricks on this guy.
Mm.
So why? Is Christian just a jerk? No. So why?
He's convinced of the importance of what he's saying.
That's right. To him, the stakes are so high and the distinction is so clear. I'm not doing you any favors by saying, live and let live. I'm not doing you any favors by saying, let's just compromise and I'm okay, you're okay, and everything's kind of fine. We are of the threshold of the celestial city, and you are going to get tossed out. Maybe ignorance has faced some hardships to get here, but it's going to come down to nothing if you get to the gate and you are not wearing the wedding garment and you are thrown out of the wedding banquet into the darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. So that's why Christian is coming down so plain and so hard. And it does make him maybe a less pleasant traveling companion, but it does make him a little more clear of a theologian. It's not super pastoral. Again, I don't necessarily recommend this as a evangelistic strategy to bring someone to the truth. But there's a clarity. And charity, the Latin caritas, the Greek agape, the divine love, which is willing to say no. This is the wrath of God, which is the passionate no. The child slips your hand, runs towards the busy street. Do you have a gentle interaction, or do you snatch him back and say no? So, in a similar manner that Christian and hopeful themselves were chastised by the angel, we get a little verbal chastisement. So I will say that Christian starts off a little softer. It even I think mentions he takes a fatherly tone. So there are two competing sources of authority between ignorance and Christian. So to hearken back to my source of knowledge about Australia, what are some of the things? Why did I believe Australia exists?
Far away.
Well, but why do I think it exists? Since I've never seen it.
Oh. Because so many people not that interested.
People. People have told me about it. There's pictures and video and whatever. I'm taking on authority, but it's authority that not only seems plausible, it seems trustworthy. So they are saying, ignorance is saying one thing. I'm doing all right. Christian is saying another. No, you're not. And they are both arguing from this knowledge. Are you okay or not okay? Is gained through two different authorities. Ignorance has an authority he appeals to, and Christian has an authority he appeals to. When everything is like, well, why do you think you're okay? Or why is this good? Or whatever. What is ignorance's authority that he appeals to? He says this repeatedly. How do you know?
His heart.
It says, my heart says so. My heart says so. I feel it. It feels right. It feels proper. It feels good. It makes sense. Whatever we take that to mean, the heart is not just the metaphorical seat of emotion, but philosophically, it's typically seen as the seat of the will. My heart tells me is like that inner sense of conviction. That is my authority. It feels right. It seems right. It makes sense. Therefore, it's true. Must be. What is Christian? What does Christian continually appeal to?
The righteousness of God.
God's word.
The word. So yeah, he is appealing to the righteousness of God, but every time ignorance says, well, my heart says such and such, Christian like blows a gasket and he says, but that's not in scripture anywhere. You know, whenever scripture mentions the way your heart feels, it's virtually always about how it is unreliable. It's wicked, it's deceitful, it will trick you, it will fool you, it will lead you astray. You are basing your opinion on the authority of something that is inherently unreliable. It has become a super common trope in contemporary fiction, and I mean books, plays, movies, TV shows, whatever. The unreliable narrator. What used to be a real twist, like if you ever read a book, like spoiler alerts, there's some Agatha Christie books where the murder mystery turns out to be the narrator. The murder of Roger Ackroyd, as a matter of fact, turns out to be the narrator. He did it. That, which was like, oh, what? Has now become very common, where you follow along from a point of view that you were given, only to be, aha, surprise, that point of view was leading you astray all along. Now, if you were told from the beginning, now, by the way, don't listen to a word I say, we then receive a narrative differently, right? When we get, who ate the cookie? You got two kids, and you have the child who tends to tell the truth and the child who doesn't tend to tell the truth. We get two different stories from them about who ate the cookie. Which one do we tend to listen to? The one who usually tells the truth.
The one that has the crumbs on
The
her.
one that might have to be actually smarter. But we are
Think it comes.
what is that? There's one of those like logic problems about you're faced with like turn to the path to the left, path to the right, and the person in the middle, the oracle in the middle says, when you ask the guy, he can never tell a lie, or he always lies, and he says go to the left, whatever. But we are in a position of, just because you're getting a story that seems plausible, or a story that you even kind of resonate with or like, is that source reliable or not? And how reliable is your emotional state in general?
Well, I'm sure by now you've had your kids come home with outrageous stories.
Definitely happens. I don't think that I am the least reliable person I've ever met. It's something I work at. It's something that means, that's significant to me, and I try, but I would be in bad shape if I trusted how I felt at any given moment. Because my feelings, while useful, helpful, true in their own way, they're just not super reliable. Sometimes I feel bad about stuff, and I shouldn't. And sometimes I feel good about stuff, and I shouldn't. And sometimes I'm in a bad mood, and that kind of colors how I see everything. And sometimes I'm in a good mood, and that colors how I see, we all have stuff like that, right? For ignorance to continually appeal to his heart, which I think can, broadly extrapolate as his feelings. Doesn't that almost depend on the day of the week,
Mhm.
time of day, what you just ate?
What somebody else said to
What
you.
somebody else said to you 5 minutes ago, and stick it in your brain. And I have felt very hopeless about a situation that it turned out to be perfectly fine, but it was about how I was feeling that bad about 3 other things, and I get to something else, like, oh no. We can also have an opinion of ourselves that is just not particularly reliable. I can look in the mirror and see somebody who's 30, but I'm not. I still think I have darker hair than I do. Stuff like that. I am not trying to actively trick myself, but our self-conception, our feelings, all these sorts of things, they can kind of wax and wane like the phases of the moon. It's not very solid ground to build something on that you expect to be permanent. And so, of course, that is contrasted with Christian's authority, which is Scripture.
But there's interpretation.
There is, and that's not mentioned here, and so it's not, that part of it is not particularly nuanced. But he is making an appeal to something that is at least an external standard. So he can point to, as it teaches in Scripture, the heart is deceitful. It says it. Now, what that means, how it's applied in this particular circumstance, like that's where we start getting into the interpretation and the application. But he's not wrong to point to that and say, whereas ignorance really has nothing else but, well, it feels right to me. Now, what's sort of bad is that I have sympathy, lots of sympathy for ignorance about the sort of things that ignorance says. Because if you recall, ignorance is not saying like, I just want to do all these awful things, but it feels so good. No, I mean, like, ignorance is like doing some pretty decent things here. And it's always not like, it's not doing a good thing or a bad thing. It's more about what that good thing that you're doing actually means and accomplishes. So the argument is not ignorance wants to do bad, and Christian is trying to teach him to do good. Ignorance is doing good. That's not the problem. The problem is trusting that that good act is effective and sufficient. Well, how do you know it's effective and sufficient to be making these good, wholesome decisions in life? Because my heart tells me so. Okay, but Scripture says all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Scripture says, like those good deeds are like filthy rags. Scripture says, so that is the ultimate point of contention between the two. And this is where there is actually kind of a nuanced perspective to this. It's still fairly blunt, but it's more nuanced than a lot of these other discussions get. There is a somewhat subtle, and this is a very, very much a Reformation argument about where grace is within our good acts. let's say, I think it's the Methodists who would call grace prevenient. Meaning appearing before the work and inspiring the work. Is grace imputed or infused? Now these are like these are little technical theological debates that by and large, a lot of us would just, I don't even know what you mean by that, but theologians have argued over, and their churches have split over and stuff like that. And what is it? What is a technical definition? And what does is mean, and all this kind of stuff. So the argument from ignorance is not quite as stark as, well, doing good works buys a ticket into heaven. It's actually, he actually takes it a little deeper and further. To start talking about, yes, I trust in the grace of Christ too, but the grace of Christ is happening with my good works. And what Christian wants is a sharp line to say, forget all your good works and only trust in grace. We'll deal with good works later. Ignorance is trying to have them walk side by side. Christian says, get rid of good works completely and utterly. Grace of Christ. Ignorance is going to come back with what amounts to the argument against antinomianism. Again, a relatively subtle theological point. Antinomianism, which means against the law, which is sort of Paul's point where he says, because grace has made me free, does that mean that I should sin more? Well, no. If we have been freed by Christ, we ought to be freed for good works, not free to do evil. And so part of how ignorance pushes back is this, well, you're going to argue this stuff, and if it's all about grace, then what's the point of doing anything good? If why would God cut off all of these good things if we're supposed to trust so fully and utterly? Then people would do bad. And it's not an unsubtle point, but we're going to continually get back to the insistence of Christian that your good works cannot cooperate with grace. They must be fully and completely after it. So dependent. If there's a cart and a horse, the horse has to be grace. They don't walk side by side and hand in hand. Your good works must always follow fully and completely in the cart, because your good works doesn't move anything forward. We do good works out of gratitude. We do good works out of thanksgiving. We do good works out of worship. We don't do good works in cooperation with grace to somehow fulfill grace. The grace is, on the cross, the work is finished. It's not waiting for us to finish it with our lives. It's a little heavy-handed, it's a little hard and sharp. I think there's plenty to argue with nuance and argue with application and interpretation, but that is the broadest stroke points of what is being argued.
My grandmother used to tell me to do this, and so because I would be stars in my crown.
Stars in your crown, okay.
When she told you.
You're gonna get stars in your crown by doing it. Yeah. Good deed.
Couldn't get that far.
Yeah,
And the other was offer it up.
offer it up. Okay,
I don't want to do that. No.
offer it up. All right. Okay, so we have our final little story. This one is shorter, about temporary. So what do we get from temporary?
Backsliding.
Backsliding. Temporary is temporary. It's not permanent. It's not unchanging or fixed. Temporary is there and gone. Temporary is now, but not later. And this is, we're getting back into bullet points. First, secondly, thirdly, and fourthly, this is what you ought to know. They are just about out of the enchanted, I want to say enchanted forest, but I think that's a fairy tale. The enchanted lands. But they're still keeping up this conversation. They're talking about some people they used to know. They're talking about Temporary, who came from Graceless, and he used to live with old Turnback. Remember him? And so we are basically given a little bit of a story about backsliding Christians. What's backsliding?
Believed at one point and then forgot it, or
Okay, you knew and then you forgot, or you did and then you didn't.
just let it go.
It's important for a while and then you sort of give up. Backsliding is
Days or.
sure. Backsliding is typically associated with our moral behavior, but it could also be associated with our theological convictions. But it basically is like you're real fervent and passionate for a while, and then you kind of drift off. And to think about like walking up a steep hill, and you go slower and slower and slower, and you get to a point where you stop, and then because you stop moving, gravity starts pulling on you, and you start sliding backwards. And there is something to be said about a lack of forward movement and progress that allows that to happen more easily. That is true in walking up hills, and that is true in our life of discipleship.
And I have done that in a car on a snowy hill.
Okay.
It does not feel good.
No. And if you ever, for those of you who remember driving stick, and you're on even a little bit of an incline, you don't pop that clutch and you can start sliding backwards and hit the car right behind you if you aren't careful. Yeah. Moving forward, that doesn't become an issue, although it could. Speaking about Snowy Hill, for me it was icy, and I was moving forward, but something happened and I hit a little patch and the wheels are turning, but I feel the car doing this. Oh no! Now hitting what happens when you hit the gas? It gets worse because the wheels spin and now so that's a tricky situation. But this is where we are. These people stop thinking about what brought them to faith in the first place. They stop thinking about judgment. They stop thinking about death. They stop thinking about the power of grace and salvation. They start remembering the stuff they used to like. And that's where the backsliding comes in. That's where the temporary nature comes in. They basically turn back. And we have a rather evocative, but frankly, a pretty good explanation about the proverb of the dog returning to its own vomit. That has always come across as a rather gross proverb, but if you've had dogs, it's actually true. The dog will get sick. They will eat something they shouldn't. And when that started happening, we just like grab them and run outside. And, you hope you get them into the grass first. Now, you can tell the dog doesn't feel good. And you know that the action of throwing up has got to be alarming to them. And I just see them shake sometimes, like they don't like it. But like give them a second, and they're like, "Oh, look at that! That looks interesting." Oh, stop. So it is a practical truth that dogs will do that, and applied to us, applied to our sinful nature. It's basically saying we know the unpleasantness that we're trying to get out of us. But as soon as it's out of us, it's almost like we've got goldfish brains that immediately forget. And we see something enticing. It just made us sick. But now that we're looking at it and we don't feel bad anymore, we just go right back to it.
Yeah.
That is the That's kind of the miserable nature of food poisoning. You don't want to throw up, but it's the best thing for you. Your body's actually trying to get the poison out, but nobody likes throwing up. And we all try to kind of hold it in or whatever, but your body is trying to expel it. So same thing, we want this poison out of us, but as soon as it's out of us, we feel better. And as soon as we feel better, well, why not do it? I'm okay, I made it. So why not do it again?
If it's the same, maybe it won't be.
Yeah, right. It probably won't be this time. It'll probably go down better this time.
We quit drinking, but we really want another beer.
Right?
We quit smoking.
Well, it's just
and we really
one,
want another-
right? It's just one. Okay, that was our longest single chapter. What else? Anything, did anything come up that we didn't cover, or anything sometimes you make little notes, anything that you wanted to bring up? Well, we're on the cusp, I believe. We've got one chapter left. I've looked, and it's the country of Beulah, which sounds like it might be good.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking we're going to make it.
Yeah.
That the pilgrim will progress all the way to the celestial city, but we'll have to wait
Yeah.
and see in next chapter if he makes it or not. All right, so last chapter, we'll do it in 2 weeks. Everybody good?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, well, thank you very much.
We can do it.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
I was quite happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you. Same to you.